It's a privilege to be here, and I thank you most sincerely for the invitation. And just so I can get it out of the way, I knew when I walked in here I should have worn a tie, but I didn't. So there you go. I'm really glad that Adam gave those initial PowerPoints, because in the longer kind of draft version of this paper, I do kind of outline some of the statistics that I'm sure we're all aware of, or should be aware of. And also some of the economic costs associated with kind of not getting things right or not directing money, I think, in areas that could actually see us buffer against people entering the system and certainly getting people out of the system once they're well entrenched into it. So I won't bore you senseless with that. I'm just going to dive straight into what I really want to get at today, and don't do enough probably in talks that I give. I'm going to talk today about 3 young men that I first met 10 years ago when I started out doing what became a longitudinal study of repeat incarceration and desistance from crime. I'm going to tell 2 stories of success, and I'm going to focus on one story which I've entitled Major and Recurrent Derailment, and I'm going to delve into those people's lives in some detail. I've interviewed them collectively, just those 3 individuals, I think 33 times over the last 10 years, and on myself and my project officer. And we've also done interviews with their nominated significant others as well about what's gone wrong and right with their lives, the system and so forth, and I'll try and integrate a bit of that. I want to do that because I think it's really important sometimes, and I name this as one of those times, to get to the stories behind the statistics so we can understand the meaning and the real challenges involved in individuals' lives rather than in the lives of the people we think sometimes should fit into various risk inventories or templates. So that's kind of my angle on things today. And I realise this talk, I'm at the deeper end of the system. These are people that have been well entrenched in cycles of crime and violence for a long time. The guys I'm going to speak about are into their mid to late 20s. I first spoke to them between the ages of 15 and 18 years of age. And they form a small part of this larger cohort that I've been following, as I said, over time. So I'll just give you just a few introductory remarks around desistance from crime and what desistance is, and I'll just see if I can, yay. So most of us, hopefully in this room, would have heard of the term desistance. It flips the recidivism question on its head. Instead of asking why do people come back so often to prison, and we know the statistics around that, 1 in 2 within 2 years of release will return to prison. And more to the point for this talk, I think one of the most alarming statistics that isn't spoken about enough, and we don't have really good national data on this, but we do have some state data, is on the progression from juvenile custodial institutions to the adult system. And that sits at around 70 to 80% for non-Indigenous kids, and approaching 100% if you factor in males for Indigenous people who have served detention orders. That to me is a real worry. Obviously it suggests that some kind of detention or youth detention or imprisonment begets imprisonment, and we've got to concentrate, I think, on how do we get people out of that particular form of graduation, as it were, from juvenile to adult institutions. So I'm interested in the way in which people work their way out of crime, not just their way into it as well. So desistance, you've read the definition there. I'm not just going to stand there and obviously quote all these PowerPoints. I won't have time to do it. But the really important bit is that desistance from crime, just like getting into crime, has 2 important parts. Everybody stops offending. People in prison stop offending. They can still do certain offences in prison, obviously. People stop offending for a little while when they come out. There are lulls in offending. That's a primary form of desistance. But the most important form of desistance, the stuff that's really hard to do, and that I'll come back to at the end of the talk, is sustaining those lulls, those gaps in offending, and turning it into something more permanent in people's lives. And that's not just got to do with plugging various programs or material kind of items into people's lives. It has to do with the way in which those people undergo a change in self-concept and move in their own minds from being an ex-prisoner or offender to a non-offender, to a conventional citizen. That's a really hard trick to pull off for a lot of people. And sometimes I think we can push things in the wrong direction, sometimes we get it right. So I want to talk a little bit about that in these three stories today. What I'm going to do in these stories is try and isolate some of what's been turned in the literature. You can read literature from like John Laub, Robert Sampson on turning points. Fantastic book called Shared Beginnings, Divergent Lives. I thoroughly commend it to each and every one of you. Really big cohort they followed for many, many years. Turning points are really important. What makes a turning point rather than a minor ripple is the passage of sufficient time on a new course, such that it becomes clear that change has indeed occurred. What I want to illustrate, as Shad Maruna has said, is there's nothing inherent in a turning point that makes it so. There has to be other stuff around a significant moment to sustain it as a significant moment, and that's what I want to get at. And that's really what we're looking at in people's lives, I think, in these situations is, and you all would have confronted it, those that work with these young kids turning into older kids, older people. There are moments where a spark is lit, and I'm sure you've had moments where you've thought, if I could just had X, Y or Z, I could turn that spark into a flame. But for whatever reason, lack of resources, lack of time, pressure, whatever, lack of motivation on behalf of the client, it doesn't turn into that flame. I'm really interested in how do we turn those turning points and make them into all that they can be. I'll come back to this later, this notion of certification and reinforcement of actually validating a changed identity. One of the biggest things when you talk to people who have done, and I've talked to people places like San Quentin, even in California, doing 30, 40, 50-year sentences, people have got out and they still don't know whether they're really a non-offender after the 30 years of not committing crime. Who says that? Who gets to put that label back on people? The court gets to label people as an offender. Who gets to label people as a non-offender? And how does that certification process play out? I think it's really important when we think about rehabilitation and reintegration. All right, so the first story, I've called him Billy. I don't normally read from a script, but I need to today because I want to get this right. And it's kind of taken a lot of work to go over 10 years of transcripts to try and anonymise it all, obviously de-identify it, and kind of present it on the page. So I'll just say a bit, and then I'll give you a few quotes from Billy and his significant others about how he got to where he is. So Billy's in his late 20s. He married Julie several years ago and they have 3 children. 2 of the kids call him Dad, even though they know Billy is their stepdad. He proudly describes how they call him their good dad. They don't see their bad dad. He was repeatedly violent toward Julie, and she managed under very trying circumstances to eventually leave him. Julie met Billy just prior to him being sent to prison. She waited 5 years for him to be released and visited virtually every week. They now live in a quiet and well-located private rental property well out of metropolitan Adelaide. Billy's on the cusp of successfully completing a 4-year period on parole. I should say this is one of only 2 guys that I regard as being on track out of this sample of around 15. It was 50, now it's 15 guys that I've been following kind of for 10 years. He has a job which enables him to work anywhere from 3 to 6 days a week. He found the job via Julie's small business network of customers. That's significant. Like many young men, Billy has a passion for cars. He buys, repairs and sells them from his backyard on a regular basis. Dozens of vehicles might pass through his hands legitimately I should add, in a 6-month period. The money he makes from improving cars supplements the seasonal nature of the income from his regular job. He's a reliable and hard worker and was recently given the opportunity by his employer to apply for promotion. Separate to this, and due to his extensive knowledge of cars, he was offered an apprenticeship through the Motor Traders Association. After more than a decade, Billy earned the right to apply for his driver's licence, a licence cancelled at Her Majesty's pleasure in connection with his offending. I was in court that day and I wrote a letter of support for him, and he was really happy. He was really happy. That was a significant moment. The court awarded him that capacity not long ago, a real milestone, as I've said, in his journey towards getting on track. Billy's wife is self-employed, runs a small business from their home. Billy and Julia are in semi-regular contact with their parents and they help out with the kids wherever possible. Billy's also a father to a child from a previous relationship and after much negotiation, including court proceedings, spends most weekends with him. He is content with his lot but wants to save up to buy a property on a little bit of land somewhere to give the kids a chance to grow up outdoors and somewhere further out of town. Things were not always like this. Indeed, Billy had all the hallmarks of being entrenched in long cycles of crime and violence. At 14, he was kicked out of school for hitting the principal. At roughly the same age, he stole his first car and received his first detention order. He'd tell in an interview that at the core of his offending, the thing that sparked his overt anger toward others and the world generally was finding out that his father was not, in fact, his biological father. He said, "When I turned 14, my uncle told me that my stepdad weren't my real dad, and then my mum told me. That's when I started getting into crime. I thought mum didn't care, so I thought, oh, well, if I do some crime, maybe she might care." The news about his father literally shook his world, and it took him many years to recover from such. Billy would subsequently spend his juvenile years in and out of detention, serving longer orders on each occasion. By his late teens, early 20s, he'd escaped twice from custody, once as a juvenile and an adult, driven his vehicle into police cars to evade capture, committed aggravated robbery, breached his home detention, allegedly been bashed by prison officers, and much more. He knows what it's like to have a police pistol pointed at him. Since first being admitted into custody at age 13, Billy spent nearly 9 of the next 12 years in one or another custodial facility. When being sentenced as an adult, the judge on one occasion reminded Billy of his poor record, that he had racked up close to 100 charges in just the last few years. He called Billy a menace to society. Up until he was paroled, more than 1/3 of his life had been spent behind bars. At interview, Billy lamented the total number of custodial days that he had indeed served. He was committed to change, perhaps already had changed as a result of a 5-year stint straight out of juvenile. Many prisoners, many people talk about changing their life, but few actually do. So let me give you a few remarks now before I give you the next story about what Billy was saying about things. These are just some quotes that I think go to some key themes. There are many others, but obviously I have to keep it tight for today. The first thing I've noticed, not just in this group but others in the literature that I've read obviously and talked to colleagues overseas about people that work their way out of serious repeat offending, they start to get realistic about their chances of coming back. They don't say in absolutist fashion, "I'm not coming back." They don't have that huge declarative kind of statement. There was a realism in Billy's tone for a long time. He knew that he could be done for small things, and he recognised that, and that was becoming the more likely thing that he would come back to prison for. So he had a moderated outlook. It could go well, it could go badly. I want it to go well, but I realise things could go off track. The study I'm involved in is about fundamentally something called generativity, the way in which people start to care about their legacy, their sense of self, their children and so forth, and how they actually affect the next generation and where that rises. And in Billy's case, he had this. He came out to a woman who'd already had 2 children by someone else, and those children started to validate him and started to act as an important protective and moral force in his life, and they went and visited him in prison, obviously, and would act as a handbrake on him, and he began to take that seriously. You don't have to read all of these, it's just to prompt me. All right? I'm not going to do a death by PowerPoint for you. And one of my key points that I'll come back to, but if I don't get time, I'll say it now, is that everybody's path out of crime, just as everybody's path into crime, is truly unique. There are common factors, but unless we drill down and understand the push and pull factors in each individual's lives, we're not going to get it right. So he had 2 other major things going in his life. He'd got to the stage where he realised if he went back into prison, Julie would suffer, the kids would suffer, and he deeply cared about that. But there was something else that was deterring him from going back into prison. I'm not here to stand up and tell some romantic set of stories. It's much more complex than that. He had something else going on as well. He knew that if he went back into prison because of what happened previously, there was someone in there that would do him serious physical harm, and that scared him. And this is a guy that is not easily rattled. So he had these interesting two push and pull factors, if you like, that were keeping him out of custody. Yes, he had the family, he had the kids, he was doing well in his job, but he also had a fear, a genuine fear of going back to prison. Not about serving more time, it was about fear of personal harm. The very individual, specific situation probably happens elsewhere to others, but in his situation, it mattered. This is the really important bit, and this is the bit about doing secondary desistance, moving from just stopping crime to actually becoming someone who sees themselves, and not just that others see that person as a non-offender. So it's about trying to remove the master status, the master's label of offender. He had that. He had some validation of his emerging new self going on, absolutely critical. He had it from his partner, he had it from his family, he had it from his children, and really importantly, he had it from his employer as well. And anybody who works in that field trying to get employment for past offenders knows how difficult that can be, but it's a really important social and economic space that's got to be opened up for people, because we're going to spend money on them anyway, keeping in lockup. You know the story and where I'm headed with that. It's really important to do. We need new conversations, I think, about that. He had something else going on, and this comes from his partner, Julie, and my colleague and I have quoted this in another paper that will hopefully come out later in the year. Her strength of her relationship with him was forged through the prism of the prison. And she found prison as a safe space to forge that intimate relationship and to take her time, knew that he was under control, etc. And it laid the groundwork for what became a very successful relationship, and they got married and so forth. So, and again, a small point, but a really important point for her. She, all is not lost, I guess, in terms of some of these young men, obviously in prison. I'm certainly not here to tell any, overly kind of dire stories. The other thing for Billy, a lot of people will whinge about parole, but as annoying as it was for him in terms of his reporting, in terms of not being able to go on licensed premises, he found it to be a positive constraint, because he knew if he mucked up, he was going back in. And it kept a check, funnily enough, on his temper. He was known for exploding on certain occasions at certain people over certain things. Two last quotes, I think, for Billy. He was a person that was slowly becoming generative. He was starting and had the opportunity to do the very small things that most of us take for granted, whinge about perhaps, become mundane, but he actually got into it, and it started to create that conventional kind of lifestyle for him. In terms of the baby, feeding it, changing nappies, being willing to sell his beloved motorbikes to keep the family unit going. He saw himself as the breadwinner kind of role, wanted to do it legitimately, and it was reinforced through his wife and family members. And importantly, he found it really important to adopt the two girls, to give them his last name and get rid of the last name of the former guy that was in his wife's life, who was incredibly abusive as well. So he had this project going, if you like, that was about this validation of this new emerging kind of self. So that's a little bit, and a comment from Julie also around, he loves to provide for us. He makes sure that everything we have we need is paid for well before he touches it, putting others first. So he had this kind of ability to do that. But he had a reason to do it as well. He had everything in place. I think the slide was up there. If it wasn't, he said, "We've got everything now. That's why I'm staying out of crime." So that's the first story. The second kind of success story that I want to talk about is Charlie. So Charlie's also in his late 20s, and he met Michelle, his current girlfriend, around 8 years ago, and has been with her since, and they reside well beyond city limits again. I'll say something about that in a minute. And for some time lived with Michelle's parents. Recently they moved into their own place, a property owned by her parents, for which they pay them rent. Charlie and Michelle's relationship endured through 3 years of Charlie's imprisonment and has continued for almost 4 years in the community. For 2 of those years, Charlie was on parole. He and Michelle have recently had a child together. They have 3 children, the 2 older being from Michelle's previous relationship. Her ex-partner has nothing whatever to do with her own children. In Charlie's words, one day Michelle found out something that he did really bad. That meant the end of his relationship with his kids and with Michelle. In the 4 years since leaving prison, Charlie has managed to all but overcome his heroin addiction. He's constantly sought work and has done all kinds of maintenance jobs, including cleaning toilets and the like. After years of being disqualified from driving, indeed never having had a driver's licence, he recently earned the right to sit for his learner's and probationary permit. In addition to getting his own life on track, he spent considerable time trying to steer his siblings away from crime as well. Some significant progress has occurred in that regard, no mean feat for a family that has notched up decades of custodial time between them. Through his commitment to fatherhood and his strong work ethic, Charlie has won the respect of Michelle's family. The hard-won respect of Michelle's father has been of particular significance to him. Charlie and Michelle plan to get married, but are waiting until one of them secures a full-time, steady job. It's been a long road for Charlie to get to this point. He was first in custody at 12 years of age and would cycle in and out of juvenile training centres until age 18. This included 4 detention orders and numerous other short stays for breaching his bail and failing to show up to court. He grew up in a notoriously crime-ridden part of Adelaide and started stealing push bikes around age 10. He stole his first car at age 12. As it happened, this car turned out to be the one his brother had already stolen. From that age, he wanted to prove to his brother and his brother's mates that he could steal cars and make money just like the older boys. Charlie started dealing drugs at 13 years of age and subsequently broke into shops and businesses to support his habit. He went on to commit a more serious range of offences through his teen years and early 20s, including serious criminal trespass and armed robbery. He also developed a dependence on heroin. Charlie's mother, long since separated from his father, tells how when Charlie was very young, her then husband, intoxicated by beer and Serapaks, nearly killed 2 of her other sons in a car accident. One of them flew through the windscreen and suffered lifelong injuries. She says her ex-husband was a violent alcoholic who was bent on killing his children and who spent most of his days in jail or drunk. She eventually, quote, left a note on the table and a carton of beer saying that the alcohol won out over her. Charlie's not commented on any accident, but he has said that he remembers his father doing, quote, 15 years once, and that this, quote, might have been for a tax on us maybe when we were kids. So how did Charlie put it together? Well, again, it's these really individual, quirky factors. He had, and narrated in a number of interviews, a premonition. He thought if he continued, he was going to die in a car or he was going to kill someone else in a car. And this really woke him up. His thing was car theft, obviously, driving at high speeds and so forth, a bit of ram raiding. And of course he had that premonition and they did go out and they did crash one night, and it really started to, that was a real turning point in his mind, that something has to change. So that's one key factor. The next thing is that he managed to find someone and something to desist for. I haven't met anybody that can truly summon it from within. We're all social beings to some extent, and we need something and someone to do things for and with. As you said, meeting her, done it. You know, when I got with Michelle, it's all just changed everything. The kids started calling me Dad. That certification, that validation thing, if I got locked up, it would break their hearts. He had something to lose, and having something to lose is really, really critical in this regard. Don't worry about reading it all. It's just to say that another really important thing I've found in the guys that I've been studying is that the people that get out of the life start to develop this notion of deferred or staged gratification, which we've all heard of, but they actually put it into practice. He'd narrated a number of times a plan, this bit-by-bit approach. He went from saying, I'm going to have it all when I get out. Within the first week, I'll have a car, I'll have a girl, I'll have a job. Totally unrealistic, had not been able to put that together and had tempered over time his approach. And slowly but surely, he's put every single one of these things in place with his partner over a long period of time, except they haven't got married yet. So that bit-by-bit realistic approach without dropping down into despair, keeping hope alive. Don't worry about reading this again. Again, I keep saying this, it's just to prompt me. I'll come back to this at the end. This, I think, was one of the most important things in this guy's life in terms of staying out of lockup and not costing the state a whole lot more money for putting him back in. And at the end of the talk, I also said people desist through crime, to be frank about it. Very few people go cold turkey. The legal and social space to stumble, to muck up, is really important. He drove a car he was doing up around the block one day. He needed to sell it to get the money. He was trying it out to see if he'd fixed up the engine properly. He wasn't doing anything stupid. He was going to go, of course that's a breach. It's a new offence actually for him at that time. He was going to be put back in prison. Critically, really critically, his parole officer spoke up and backed him. Really important. He had a good relationship with his parole officer. It worked for him. And secondly, the judge also recognised what was going on as well. But the key point is in red there. The way in which something can be on a knife edge, and if it's just people given that second, sometimes that third chance, good things can happen, that they don't become an overt risk or danger to society, and you can build on the good things that happen. Sometimes we cancel out those good things that have happened, and sometimes it's hard to realise the trajectory that people are on. Absolutely critical in both of these cases and in most of the other studies, and talking to colleagues that have done the same thing overseas, UK, US. Geographically knifing off from one's area has to be one of the key things for getting people to stop serious repeat offending and going back into prison over long periods of time. But these two people had someone and some place to go to get them out of their areas of offending. The majority of people, at least that I've spoken to, don't. They don't have that social and economic capital to connect with. He did. I think that's right. Yeah, that's it. So let me just come to the last case, which is a little bit more despairing. Am I all right for time? Okay. This is and please forgive me for this is a much longer and in-depth story, but I think it's a story that's really important to tell because it's actually a story about how someone goes off the rails in a major way, and that there were moments where perhaps things could have been different, but it's ended pretty badly. And I think it sort of drills down to the complexities in people's lives, and sometimes the way in which, not people in this room, you all work with these young people, but I'm talking, I guess, the trying to get a debate or a discussion going that can more meaningfully be had in the larger public realm about some of the issues and pressures that young people face without the public kind of being annoyed or inflamed like that by that discourse. To actually understand that there are some really, truly horrific situations going on, and that people need support even when they are actually doing things that danger themselves and others, and to try and get that kind of conversation going. Anyway, I've called him Chris. Chris is in his mid-20s. He spent more than 10 years in custody within juvenile and adult institutions. His longest period in the community can be measured in just a matter of months. Indeed, he spent less than 5% of his adult life out of lockup. He was diagnosed with ADHD and put on medication very early in his life. And this is not an ADHD mental health kind of story. This is not where this is going. I just say that because it came out of the transcripts. Chris's mother stopped the medication after a few years, and from that point on his behaviour became unmanageable. His father contends that Chris's mother was in fact diverting his medication in order to supplement her own long and difficult battle with drugs. Things came to a head when the father returned home from work to find Chris's mum teaching Chris's brother, aged under 10 at the time, how to inject heroin. Chris's father walked out on the whole family that very day. It's something he regrets deeply and yet simultaneously holds was his only option. At age 8, Chris's uncle, who did time for murder, took Chris along to help him steal goods from a sports store, telling him there's no need to buy something when you can just take it. Chris received his first detention order at around age 11. He was then placed in a series of foster homes, always running away to try and connect with his birth family, a family that had literally fallen apart through drugs, alcohol, violence, and an inability to comprehend what conventional parenthood could or should look like. At 12, Chris did several months for burglary, break and enter and motor vehicle theft. Around this age, he witnessed his girlfriend hit by a truck. She was running away from Chris after an argument they had. He dropped permanently out of school around year 8 or 9. He'd seen his older brother wagging and thought it was cool. Chris also describes how he was expelled for stealing, so either way, educationally, he didn't go much past primary school. At 13, Chris witnessed his uncle sexually abuse his sister. His efforts to convince his parents of the truth of this fell on deaf ears. Chris was also sexually abused by his uncle, something which he has told only a handful of people, which took him 7 years to volunteer to me during the interview. Around the time of the abuse, his mother moved interstate and left him to the care of his auntie, who died shortly thereafter. Chris set out to track one or both of his parents down. He found them but was promptly rejected by them again. In his mid-teens, he made his way interstate. He was by this time raising himself, surviving through whatever means he could muster. Along with his brother, he stole cars, committed robberies to eat, but also to fund their methamphetamine habits. The drugs made Chris's offending worse. He said, "When I'm on speed, I have the guts to do anything, and I do it," he told me. In broad daylight, it became routine for him to point a gun at someone's throat to get money. Guns were, quote, easy to get because his brother already had one. They also stole guns and ammunition from business premises to ensure they were sufficiently armed. Chris said he was doing all this, quote, because his mum and dad didn't give a stuff about me. The hankering to reassemble the family unit was to recur throughout most of his interviews. What a really hard task that is to try and put back into place. He said, "I want to go back to when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I want to start from back there," he would say. By the time he was about 16, he was serving time for home invasion associated offences. The judge reduced his sentence as the victim testified that Chris had been the one to help nurse her stab wounds until paramedics arrived, wounds inflicted on her by Chris's co-offender. At the time, Chris, quote, started realising that crime isn't the way to go. Still, he would end up offending the day he was released. He had $700 to his name and gave half to his mother, who he'd patched things up with to a certain extent. He spent the remainder on drugs and alcohol. His addiction to speed led him to steal a car in order to travel to his dealer. After stealing petrol and running over the attendant, Chris was caught when his car careered out of control during a high-speed pursuit. He was sentenced to a further period of detention. Around this time, Chris learned his mother was admitted to hospital as a result of injuries inflicted by his father and brother, and that they had both been incarcerated for this. Chris was released from detention without conditions. End of order. He lasted 1 week before being locked up again. By then his brother was out of prison and again they started stealing cars and doing drugs. Like so many times previously, Chris was drinking to block out, quote, bad memories. And like the times before, he was stealing cars because it was the only, quote, fun he ever knew. On one occasion, to add to the sense of fun, Chris and his brother decided to torch the vehicles, except things went horribly wrong. Over the noise of flames and explosions, Chris's brother couldn't hear that he was trapped. He failed to realise that the heat had melted the clasp of Chris's seatbelt, rendering it unworkable. The belt itself was also starting to sear into his torso. After being rescued, Chris spent 6 days in a coma on life support and 2 weeks in hospital. His mum came to visit him and told Chris that, quote, his heart stopped 4 times. Chris tells how he woke up with, quote, 150 staples in my chest and 150 on my back and another 50 on my arms. Apparently, even the arresting officers had tears in their eyes when they saw him. Chris went from hospital to detention. This time he got out with $150 in his pocket and was on morphine and speed within 2 days of release. Quote, as soon as I had drugs, I was fucked, he said. He stole a car 2 days after that and was doing ram raids and related offences to satisfy his desire for drugs and alcohol. He would swap alcohol and other stolen goods for clothes. And he would offend to numb the pain. Over a 3-day period, Chris estimates he was involved in 17 high-speed pursuits. He was caught and given further time in detention. By this point, lockup was of course becoming his home. Chris said as much. When I'm out, I've got no one, so really in here is like a family to me. All the staff is like my family to me. Essentially, I'm coming back to my friends. Around 18 years of age, Chris was transferred to prison for assaulting training centre staff. He was eventually released, returned to custody and bailed all in the space of a few days. Around that time, Chris got together with a new girlfriend, Marie, and she fell pregnant. They lived for a short time with her mother until she kicked them out over an undisclosed argument. She called Chris and Marie dogs. about the worst insult she could throw at Chris. He tried to stab her, but the weapon missed its mark. Marie's mother retaliated, not by attacking Chris, but by kicking her own pregnant daughter in the stomach. A neighbour tried to intervene, but Chris threatened him and told him in no uncertain terms to mind his own business. Eventually, Chris and Marie stole a car with the aim of heading far away from the sorrow and the trauma defining their lives. But Chris lost control of the car on the outskirts of town and crashed, he reckons, at about 190 kilometres an hour. The car was a twisted wreck. Chris says the front bumper was bent to the point of resting against the boot. With the engine resting on his legs and the steering wheel pinned against his chest, both he and Marie were cut out by the jaws of life. Marie lost the baby. Chris, in a most extraordinary act of desperation and denial, suggested that the baby's death must have been caused through the paramedics strapping Marie too tightly to the stretcher. He again spent time in intensive care. Chris and a visiting friend took this as an opportunity to self-administer or siphon off the morphine meant to keep Chris's physical pain to a manageable level. Chris transitioned again from hospital to prison and said that the time inside would give him the chance to change my life. He was yet to turn 19. He spoke at that stage of, quote, wanting to stick with my girl so she can be my wife and have my kids. Not long after committing to this, Chris punched Marie in the face for having the temerity to bring another male friend with her to visit him. "I'm not your fucking mate," Chris told the intruder. He continued to berate him, saying, "Don't talk to me, sit there like a dumb C." Marie tried to make the peace, saying that Chris shouldn't get so angry. She lost 2 of her teeth for her troubles. That evening, Marie received a phone call from Chris asking if she was, quote, still thinking about him. She maintained her rage for a while, but eventually started up again as Chris's girl. After several years, he was paroled. This time, Chris lasted a month. In that month, he would allegedly perpetrate a wide range of serious offences. This would lead him to being remanded in custody for a period that would far exceed the average time served for most other prisoners. Chris spoke of being strung out on ice and of having only, quote, 2 hours sleep for the entire month of his release. During this time, Marie again fell pregnant. Upon learning that Chris was the father's-to-be, Marie's father cut sick on her. He, quote, punched her, choked her and chucked her through a window, causing her to lose her unborn baby, the second such occurrence. Immediately following this, her father went and hanged himself. Marie, still in her teens, found his lifeless body. The sheer magnitude of the trauma she'd been through reignited her own history of self-harming behaviour. Chris, feeling powerless to do anything, did the only thing he could do to illustrate his empathy for Maria's plight. He told her that whatever she would do, he would do also. If she kills herself, he said, I'll kill myself. If she cuts herself, I'll hurt myself. Because the way I look at it, if I lose her, I've lost everything. At that point, Chris felt disgusted with himself, saying, I hate myself for what I've done. And just to close, since that time, he's continued to plumb the depths of despair. This has been punctuated with the occasional silver lining, such as the commencement of a new relationship with a woman who, according to Chris, understands who he is and whose children view Chris as a father figure. Chris also briefly re-established ties with his own father. However, just a few days after this rapprochement, his older brother, fresh out of prison, attempted to strangle their father to death. Apparently, Chris's brother was heavily intoxicated. He drank a slab of beer within hours of being released from a lengthy stretch and took extreme umbrage at being told by his father to put his seatbelt on for the long trip home. Chris has sworn to take revenge against his brother. This kind of anger, mixed with all the other physical and psychic pain that infuses his life, defines most of his days in custody. His strategy for coping with his plight has been to slowly but surely cut loose of the few people who care about his welfare. It's become almost impossible for Chris to conceive of a future involving anything good. Life for him is a protracted waiting game, and being confined without knowing his fate is playing hard on him. He said, I would rather be dead before I come back to jail. He said that in his most recent interview. He's told himself that any sentence less than 10 years would be a bonus. So thanks for hanging in there on that story. That comes from 11 or 13 transcripts, I think, over the last 10 years. And I read that and put that together because I really don't want to stand up here as an academic who thinks it's just really easy and everything should just fall into place and we can really rebuild people's lives, because that's just a lie. Nothing could be further from the truth. But part of what I want to say is that the reason we can't build people's lives and get people like that back on track, obviously it's intergenerational, and I'll come to that in a minute, but part of the problem is that the system we all work in is hanging on by its fingernails. It's not well funded. People who work in the system don't have the resourcing and the time and the effort to offer the sustained, individual, continuous care needed for someone like that. Until we understand that and fund that better, we'll keep spending money at the deeper end of the system. And in having a helicopter out at night chasing guys like this, which costs tens of thousands of dollars, or in locking them up and so forth. So I want to say that I think I get a little bit of the challenges, and this is a huge one. And this is just one story over the last 10 years. Let me talk a little bit about Chris, and then I'll say some concluding remarks, and I'll get off. I was watching a doco the other night, and the term parentified came up in it, and I thought that's a really good term. It occurs to me, thinking about Chris's life, this is the problem with so many kids that we all come in contact with. They are parentified at an early age, especially GOM kids, guardianship of the minister kids. They are expected to bring themselves up and all the issues that go along with that. And what Chris wanted all along is not to have to do that, not to be his own parent. Very simple question. What was missing in your childhood? Love. And he's answering this in amongst all of this other violent, horrific stuff that he is doing. He wants love. I didn't want to be brought up by my own. I wanted to be brought up by my own parents. I didn't want to bring myself up. Marie says this has led, to him. He doesn't even understand the basics of life. He was like a child trapped in a man's body. You've all heard that before, an adult's body. But the real hub of it is I was privileged enough, and I have to say and publicly acknowledge the courage of the people that I've interviewed over the years, because I wouldn't be where I am without their help. And they are partners in this project, funded by the Australian Research Council, yes, but they are partners in this project, and I'm committed to them, and I thank them for their frankness and their honesty. So when I eventually met, many years later, and interviewed Chris's dad, he himself, and as Chris has narrated here, said there is an absolute lack of intergenerational modelling. That's another really big task for society to try and repair. This is a passage from Chris's father when I tried to delve into a little bit about his life, because I wanted to understand how it could go so wrong for his son, for Chris. Where was he at? He was in and out of foster homes, kids' homes between the ages of 2 and 16. He says he didn't have parents to turn to. Is this the right way or is it the wrong way? He said when he got out of his boys' home, the first thing his father did to him was he hit him. When I came to, I said, what was that for? And he said, that's for coming home. I was 16, and he turned around and said to me, I raised you better than that. And I said to him, because he grabbed my chin, knocked his hand away, I said, you didn't bring me up. Welfare, child welfare brought me up. And I think that's part of the puzzle, isn't it? And part of the solution is that you've got an individual in front of you, and the state thinks it's got an individual in front of you, but you've got so much more than that. You've got a family with all those intergenerational issues. You've got employers that need to get on side. You've got the whole mental health system that needs to get on side. You've got the education system that needs to get on side. And to work across all these silos is, quite frankly, bloody hard. But we've got to do better at it. But this intergenerational stuff, and it's where I guess my future research is headed, on intergenerational incarceration and so forth, I think is absolutely critical to come to grips with. This is part, I think, of the massive turning point in Chris's life, and why he wasn't even able to get primary desistance going. He wasn't even able to have a lull between offending. Because for some reason, over the years, cracks developed and he fell through them. Yes, he did bad stuff himself, but no one was able to successfully resolve the shame and self-blame he felt about that sexual abuse that he experienced and witnessed. Some workers interstate did work with him, but there's got to be some, people move around, there's got to be some continuity of knowledge and expertise across borders as well as within states as well. and the inability to resolve this sort of thing. And I'm not someone who stands up and believes necessarily whatever happens to you as a kid, you're on a trajectory and that's it. I'm not saying that, but in this particular instance, I am going to say that because I think it's true. And the evidence bears that out very strongly. This manifests itself in all the stuff that I've just been speaking about then, because this couldn't be dealt with properly. Again, the next thing is just that immediate support in the hours, literally the hours, minutes, hours and days following release. We know that is where the most crucial stuff needs to happen, and we need active people out there supporting people, not in a way that creates overdependence and certainly not in an underdependent way, but we need that services right there when people walk out, and those institutions, agencies responsible for that need to be far better funded. 24/7 assistance, this is something that he said. If there was someone on the outside that they love, that they know they're going to stick by them 24/7, you've all heard it. People hate telling their story to a new worker again. And my experience is they'll tell even less and less and less, and the complexities of that original story they told to someone they built trust with gets lost, and then you don't get to the real hub of the matter. I can say more about his life later, but I know I've got to wrap up, so I'll just say a few concluding remarks. All right? Okay. Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to say is I reckon it's incredibly easy to underestimate how hard it is for people to get out of crime who have experienced serious repeat engaged in serious repeat offending and have spent a good amount of their life, a third, perhaps half of their life, nearly in custody, even in their mid-20s. It is an incredibly difficult project. Generally speaking, unless one is personally affected by crime, unless one has walked alongside someone trying to work their way out of years of offending, the difficulties associated with the process tend to be poorly understood. Public debate tends to gel around one of two poles. Either people fail to desist because they choose to do more crime, since being out of lockup means they are, after all, free to stop offending or to go on and offend, to re-offend. Or people don't desist because they suffer from some psychological malady. Their behaviour is therefore predetermined. The truth, of course, lies between these two poles, and it's far more complex. So I'd argue that there are very few offenders who actively and consciously want to live their lives through the rubric of crime. Crime is hard work, and the gains to be had from it are few. Kudos, wealth, even happiness can all be derived from crime, but for the vast majority of offenders, these are fleeting events, not enduring states. Crime is also tiring, and the two guys that I spoke to earlier about being on track, there's other passages in their interviews where they say, I'm sick of going back to prison. It's just hard work. They become tired of it. They become tired of losing everything and having to start again. And they know to start again they're going to have to do more crime. They're going to get caught and go back into prison. The people who don't desist from serious repeat offending generally fail not because they are malicious or stupid or uncaring or selfish or the like. Instead, they fail because they can't find the right set of personal and social hooks onto which they can hang the very idea of a future really distinct from their past. By that I don't mean let's try and promote some trivial imagining game, oh, you're sitting here and you're in your 5th year in whatever, B division or whatever, and let's just imagine how it can be this time when you get out. That's not where I'm headed with that. Where I am headed with that is the importance of trying to create a psychic space, but also link that to a practical space where people can start to see a life different from their past and then engage that life and work meaningfully towards that. The general trend, I would say, is for people to become, especially the cycles that I've sort of analysed, to become overwhelmed by life on the outside and to fall back into the skin which feels most comfortable. And that skin obviously revolves around crime. Secondly, unless we understand how hard it is for people to desist from crime, and I'm focusing on these people because these are the people doing the disproportionate amount of damage to themselves and to society in any one year in terms of what's formally labelled crime. And yes, this isn't corporate offences. I'm mainly talking about street crime and violent crime. And they're the 10% responsible for the 40% of damage, if you like. So it makes strategic, political and economic sense to get it right for these people. Unless we understand how hard it is, we're going to underinvest in the things which I think can support major transformations of self, because that's what getting out of crime is about. It's about undergoing a massive transformation of self in who you think you are and what you do, and about what other people think of you and will allow you and permit you to do. What Deirdre Healy and others have called in her book the crucible of change needs to be surrounded by structured pathways whereby primary desistance, that initial break between offences, can get a proper foothold. Pathways to school, job training, stable accommodation, all the stuff we know. These structures need to employ at least, I think, and this would be my one of my take-home messages, these kinds of structures that get people going on their journey need to employ at least some people known as professional X's, people whose own desistance project has been strengthened by giving back to others who are starting out on the desistance journey. It means involving ex-offenders, obviously, in the project of desistance. And in the wider draft of this paper, I've tried to drill down and get some numbers on the population of potential or would-be desisters in this country at any one time. It runs into the tens of thousands. This kind of help is called retroflexive reformation, to give it its fancy title. It's a powerful but hugely underutilised resource in the area of rehabilitation and reintegration, and there are all sorts of barriers to re-entry, ironically, into the professions where I think some of those people could make the greatest inroads. I've seen it happen in the US and the UK. It's very powerful. The point is that we need to do better at getting desistance started in literally the days and weeks following release in order to have something to build on as those days and weeks turn very quickly into months and years. And I am acutely aware how naive that sounds, and that so many people will say to their parole officer or their release worker, I don't want to see you. I don't want to see you. I just want to ring up, I'll do my rock up and report, and I'm out of there. I don't want any relationship with you. I understand that. And you might be the best release worker, parole officer, youth worker under the sun. That means but that doesn't mean they don't want help or support with stuff that's going down. And I have had calls from guys where stuff is going down. They cannot get help. Stuff's going off the rails. They're ashamed. They don't want to ring up their worker or their parole officer. They're scared of being breached. There needs to be some other quarter that can offer assistance in that regard. I don't know whether that's some kind of mentoring. I don't know whether it's some kind of 24/7 drop-in place, line, phone line, whatever. I don't know. I know that when people try and give the numbers to crisis care, people can be hanging on for 40 or 50 minutes. I've done it myself on behalf of some of these guys. A lot can happen in 40 or 50 minutes. Thirdly, the development of networks, or I've talked about, it's important to focus on the development of networks of social certification and validation. Integral for what Shad Maruna has brilliantly described as how do we turn prisoners back into citizens, that is, or how do we turn residents, if in juvenile institution, back into citizens. That is an incredibly complex question, and it's one that we don't do very well. Primary desistance is necessary for turning prisoners back into citizens, but it's very far from being sufficient. It's not sufficient just to have that lull between offences. The most critical part of doing or supporting desistance is ensuring that would-be desisters have real and ongoing opportunities to receive social affirmation of their change process. Think about how seriously we take the process of trying to convert primary school children into high school graduates, or the amount of time and energy invested to turn an amateur athlete into an Olympic gold medalist, or the resources it takes to turn a cadet into a soldier. All of these things involve monumental commitments of time from various bodies. They involve extensive avenues for entry, recruitment and training, economic investment, and strategies for assisting those who might temporarily go off track. In addition, though, and most importantly, they involve rituals of certification which signify the completion of what Maruna calls a rite of passage. You've engaged in an important social task through an important and major institution, and you've arrived at the other side, and it's recognised. It's important to ask what quantum of time and resources are allocated to the really complex task of turning prisoners back into citizens, or residents back into citizens. What formal social recognition, beyond the lapsing of the requirement to report to a release worker or community corrections officer, is awarded to those who have in fact desisted from crime? What type of delabelling processes are built into people's desistance journeys? Many ex-offenders will narrate that it is in fact very important to them to have some kind of formal process whereby their process of change is acknowledged, and many think that this should be done by the institution which sentenced or denounced them in the first place. The US concept, or they have these things called a re-entry court, perhaps with some modification, they might potentially serve such a purpose. This distinction I've noted there between control and support, I'll just say a little bit about that and then I'll finish. We know that the pathway from serious repeat offending to desistance is curved, not straight, to use Healy's terms. People get to desistance very often through scaling back the severity and frequency of offending rather than stopping all offending at a particular point. This means we need to think especially hard about the longer-term social impact of being control-oriented, perhaps hyper-controlling as opposed to facilitative or more supportive of clients. Studies of probationers or parolees often talk about the way the system fixates on offenders' past lives rather than the one they actually want to build going forward. Deficit understandings of personhood and personal change, ironically, don't actually leave very much room for change to occur, for the spark of desistance to turn into something more durable. For support rather than control to be the order of the day, people who work directly with juvenile and early adult offenders need to be paid more. They need to be paid more. They need regular professional training in what works. What doesn't work, to my mind, is more CBT, MST, proliferation of risk inventories, but I'm happy to be shouted down later on about that. And they need to be meaningfully engaged in clients' lives, but not to the point of creating hyper-dependence of clients. Of course, to move even marginally away from control-oriented model of offender supervision requires political strength, and I'm certainly not saying that this is an easy or popular task. Lastly, and I'll finish on this note, I think we need to place a premium on this notion of spaces or opportunities to stumble, and to know when we're reacting to serious threats to public safety or when we can keep the desistance path alive. The desistance process is in fact very fragile for most people. But the process itself has a logic, and a key aspect of this should be the provision of the psychic or mental space and administrative space for setbacks to occur. Not turning a setback into a client's disposition to do additional and far more serious crime is probably the most important but least well understood part of the desistance conundrum, but it's one we certainly need to grapple more seriously with. I'll leave it there. Thank you.